Hi, I'm Nethmin Liyanage, and I'm joined by Daniel Shatzkin from Champion Briefs, and we're going to be talking about the NSDA 2021 topic, which is resolved: a public health emergency justifies limiting civil liberties.
So today we're going to start off, I guess, talking about some topicality and some kind of creative interpretations that you can have on the topic. The NSDA topic is always one that debaters tend to try and find a narrow interpretation kind of that fits their affirmative, that's very descriptive for the topic. And with this unique topic, especially because we're debating kind of while still going through the actual topic literature event, it kind of makes the specificity very easy to find on what a public health emergency is, on what a limitation of a civil liberty is. And so, Nethmin, do you want to go into kind of the specifics of those issues?
Yeah, for sure. So I think that the first issue to address the topicality is terms of art. And if you've been reading my TAs this year, you know that I'm really big on these. So a term of art is essentially a set of words that are strung together that have a different meaning than each of their component parts. So my favorite example is nuclear arsenals, for example. Nuclear by itself can mean like pertaining to a cell. An arsenal can mean a collection of things, but obviously no one interpreted the nuclear arsenals topic to be about cell collections. Similarly, this topic, there are two kind of terms of art that I think are relevant. So the first is public health emergency, and the second is civil liberties, because the way that debaters interpret each of these words can kind of change the way that the topic is skewed, and specifically what negative offense answers the affirmative that's chosen. So in the phrase public health emergency, obviously what most people's or all people's minds are going to go to immediately is COVID and the pandemic that's currently occurring. And I think that that is what a good chunk of affirmatives, especially more traditionally oriented affirmatives, are going to be about. They're going to be about things like limitations of press or limitations of travel or visa restrictions, immigration restrictions in the context of COVID, because we know that those are things that we've seen lots of countries do and do them really prominently. But there are also other interpretations of public health emergency. For example, there is a huge push legislatively to consider gun violence in the United States to be a public health crisis. And similarly, there are similar bodies of literature to do with climate change and the associated illnesses that come with climate change and warming and pollution and all that stuff. So that's one thing that you'll want to look out for in creative interpretations of the phrase public health emergency. But even within more standard interpretations of the phrase public health emergency, there are varying degrees of badness when it comes to disease outbreaks. For example, the H1N1 or swine flu outbreak about a decade ago was nowhere near as bad as the coronavirus pandemic. But some might say that both of those kind of outbreaks fall under the term or phrase public health emergency. Or similarly, things like the HIV/AIDS epidemic, or even, for example, the Ebola outbreak could all be considered forms of public health emergencies. So I think you'll have to answer questions when defining this term about whether it matters, whether the disease affects everyone globally or if it's a localized outbreak or spread. And similarly, what's considered an emergency versus just a lot of people being ill. Because, for example, a lot of like kindergarten classes all come down with the flu at once, but that's not really considered a public health emergency, generally speaking, as much as it is considered just like 12 kids being ill at the same time. So I think that those are all questions of scope and magnitude and time frame that you're going to have to answer when you are defining the phrase public health emergency. And then the other phrase or term of art in this topic that I think is important is civil liberties. So within the context of civil liberties, a lot of people's minds immediately jump to the US Constitution and specifically the Bill of Rights. And that's definitely one way that you can interpret civil liberties. But there are also other ways of interpreting civil liberties, including things that are more internationally recognized, i.e. like UN Declaration on Human Rights and other standards that are enforced internationally. Or, for example, things that are more abstract and not necessarily protected within the Bill of Rights explicitly, but most have agreed that they're implicitly protected. So when viewing the limitation of civil liberties, that's something to consider. And the other thing that's notable about civil liberties, I think, is the fact that it is plural. So I think that negatives will need to prepare against affirmatives that choose one really, really specific civil liberty. And they're like, okay, we are going to limit this very specific liberty in this very specific county, this very specific jurisdiction because of X reason. And that affirmative is really tiny and functionally unnegatable. Especially given the amount of like communal prep that is not available for the NSDA topic. So I think that negatives should be prepared to go in with just like liberties means more than one liberty. You don't get your tiny one county in Georgia half. So I guess those are my general thoughts on the topic in terms of breaking down the topic and creative reinterpretations. Shatzkin, is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, I would just kind of add that I think if negatives focus on like constitutionality issues, I think they're going to be missing a large portion of the topic, because the topic really is about global restrictions on rights and whether rights should be restricted in a general sense. And I think that's something that negatives should try and focus on as well, is to focus on the general sense of the topic. Should civil liberties in general be restricted in the face of public health emergencies? It's a twisting of how the topic is worded, but I think that's the wording that negatives should try and say the topic is asking you really about. It's not asking about should the United States limit civil liberties or one specific country. It's asking whether there is some sort of justification for civil liberties to be limited on a global scale, any type of civil liberty, or multiple civil liberties on a global scale. So for me, that means that Phil F's general principle affirmatives are probably the ones that are going to be most topical, in the same way that negatives who are arguing the topic are going to find their biggest success arguing, frameworks and kind of the philosophical underpinnings of the affirmative, whether or not there is a justification at all to restrict rights. So with that said, I guess we can move on to kind of discussing those specifics in the affirmative and negative world. For me, I think that looking at the topic kind of on a broader sense, in a more philosophical sense, is really what I hate to use the word framers' intent, but that was probably what the wording committee was looking at the topic under a philosophical lens. What are the moral justifications or the philosophical or ethical justifications to restrict rights? Do those justifications exist? And are those justifications kind of true in some way? So for me, I kind of look at it starting out, my gut instinct is always util, but on a topic like this, I want to try and steer sometimes away from util. We'll get into the util apps in a minute, but I look at utilitarian philosophers maybe who would justify this principle instead of specific utilitarian standards. So one of those philosophers is Mill. Mill, to me, is kind of a philosopher who balances some of the Kantian languages and Kantian obligations, like saying freedom is very important under a Mill framework, but freedom and autonomy are not the end-all be-all under a Mill framework. Freedom and autonomy are just one part of a person's well-being, and that a government has to balance people's well-beings. This generally falls into line with like principles like Gooden, who talks about, governments have to seek out, the best possible policy options for, the most amount of people in their population. Things like that. So Mill kind of falls in line with that of saying, yeah, freedom is just one aspect of a person's well-being. And if something else exists that could damage a person's well-being more so than a limited restriction of freedom, then we should probably limit the restriction on freedom. That's basically Mill's, general principle. Freedom isn't the end-all be-all of human existence. There is life. There is our relationships with other people. And if all of those things are somehow affected long-term by like a public health emergency, Mill justifies limiting those freedoms for a little while. So Mill would probably say that travel restrictions are a good thing for a limited period of time. Mill would justify, business closures and stuff like that if it promoted a public good. So if you can prove that these things could promote a public good, Mill would then affirm. Then there's also kind of positive rights affirmatives, which are very, they're based on kind of the right to life outweighing a right to liberty. It's very similar to Mill, but it's justified kind of outside of utilitarianism and more towards just like, we all have a right to certain things, and one of those rights is actually life. It's commonly a utilitarian phrase, but it's more about the right itself to life than the concept of life. And so when we limit freedom in a public health emergency, we're doing it to promote a positive right to life. And so, negative rights are things that we prevent the government from doing, right? The government is not allowed to search without probable cause. The government technically needs a warrant for searches and seizures. A person is not allowed to be held by the state without trial. Things like that. Those are negative rights. Those are restrictions on what the state can do. So positive rights are basically freedoms. What are freedoms for? And a positive right would say that the right to life is the ultimate positive right, because the right to life precludes all the other rights. If you don't have life, you cannot have a right to freedom. You cannot have a right to, speech. You can't have a right to, privacy, or any of these rights that we consider civil liberties. All of those are negative rights. They're restrictions on the state. The positive right is a right to life. That is the only right that is a positive right that exists, that says that people can go and do things, or it's the condition necessary for freedom. Some would say that autonomy is a positive right, things like that. But if I were to tell you that you have autonomy but no life, do you really have autonomy? No. So the positive rights AC kind of boils down what the categorical imperative is, essentially, if you think about it in Kantian terms, where if the Kantian categorical imperative is freedom, a positive right AC basically says, no, the most important thing that we really have a right to is life. And the government should act always to protect life. And a government can institute negative rights in order to promote a positive right. And so a negative right would be like saying, you no longer have the right to travel freely when you want to, but we're doing this to promote the positive right of life. And so that's like a limitation on interstate travel there. I think positive rights ACs are going to be very framework heavy. And so some affirmatives are going to shy away from that, but being framework heavy allows affirmatives to insert a prioris into positive rights affirmatives and do a lot of tricky things with them. So positive rights ACs are, I think, going to be a big part of the topic. Nethmin, do you want to talk about maybe more of some specific affirmatives? I know there are a lot of util strats that are out there, but then there's also just some more specific strategies that are kind of, I guess, maybe I would call them government legitimacy strategies, or, information strategies.
Yeah, for sure. So actually, one of my favorite affirmatives on this topic is the disinformation or misinformation affirmative. And the thesis of this affirmative is that civil liberties in the context of freedom of speech and freedom of the press should be limited in order to curb the spread of misinformation, disinformation, lies, misleading information, that kind of thing regarding pandemics. So a lot of the literature based for this affirmative is specific to coronavirus, because we've seen a lot of hesitancy in vaccine uptake, or for example, misinformation about mask wearing or distancing that has been spread through online platforms or kind of media platforms that aren't necessarily the most legitimate. So the disinformation affirmative talks about how civil liberties pertaining to the spread of that information should be limited in order to, in turn, stop the spread of the coronavirus. So I really like this affirmative for a few reasons. So first, I think that this affirmative is a very good middle ground affirmative to read in a world where you have a panel that's somewhat split, i.e. someone who's a more progressive, technical, circuity judge and someone who's a more traditional but still flow-oriented judge. I think that this affirmative is still well within the comfortable grounds of the topic, so to speak. You're not reinterpreting the topic in any way that's kind of wild or objectionable to most traditional coaches, but you also have enough space to kind of specify and make your affirmative small enough that the negative cannot link like any offense under the sun to your affirmative. So I really love that affirmative for this reason. It can also be read with a variety of different framing mechanisms, i.e. you could definitely read more like soft left or structural violence oriented scenarios about how misinformation regarding vaccine locations or vaccine distribution has led to POC communities being shut out of vaccination opportunities. But you could also read it with more big stick impact scenarios about how misinformation can kill legitimate forms of governance, and that leads to like whatever impact you want to tie it to. Or you can frame it in the context of how misinformation spreads diseases, or like spreads the ability to kind of transfer communicable diseases due to misinformation about stuff like distancing. So I think that there are lots of different ways that this affirmative can be spun. So I really, really like it for that reason. And I also think that this affirmative is kind of a good place to start when doing research, even if you don't plan to read this affirmative, just because I think that a lot of affirmatives who are trying to do something that's a little bit unique, but still within the comfortable bounds of the topic, are going to turn towards stuff like this. Because obviously, the most standard affirmative on this topic, and probably the most traditional affirmative on this topic, is just going to be three contentions and some kind of consequentialist framework about how pandemics are bad and the coronavirus has been terrible for everybody. And they're just going to somehow vaguely tie that into why, like, whatever disadvantages of the coronavirus pandemic justify kind of any amount of limitation of civil liberties. And I think affirmatives who are looking to be a bit more creative and a bit more specific are going to turn to the disinformation AC. So I think it's a good thing to have prep against, even if you don't intend to actively read it.
Yeah, I also really like the disinformation AC because it gives you a lot of links into some different ground that like you may not want to go into or may not be able to go into on other topics. You can definitely go into governmental legitimacy and like how disinformation undermines governmental legitimacy during like pandemics and public health crises. It doesn't necessarily solve when disinformation is coming from the government itself during a public health emergency, but it definitely can help when disinformation is being reinforced or put out in like a private sector area. I think, though, it also leads us into kind of some of these trickier util strategies, right? Because disinformation can also connect us to a lot of things like global warming, for example, and climate change. How did disinformation affect issues with that? How does disinformation affect issues with just public health crises in general? Yeah, COVID-19 killed a lot of people. How did disinformation lead to some of those deaths and things like that? Then there's also the gun violence type affirmative that Nethmin brought up earlier. I think that these affirmatives are going to be used by a lot of debaters at NSDA Nationals because it is possible to get those panels where you have, tech flow judges or judges who are flowing and are open to utilitarian standards and offense and rounds. And I think these are going to be very difficult affirmatives for negatives to beat straight up using util. It's hard to argue against all of the deaths that the world has seen over the last year, especially within our own country, where there have been a lot of deaths, way more than many other developed nations around the world. We see things with gun violence, right? It's very hard to argue with people about gun violence in this country, but there are a lot of common sense restrictions that, like polling says, a lot of people are in favor of: red flag laws, Baker acting, background checks. All of these things technically can be justified as a restriction on civil liberties that people have towards owning a gun that are popular around a majority of the population. And the counter to them is not very, it's not very good on a utilitarian level, right? It's hard to argue against Baker acting, people who are unstable and maybe prone to violence at that moment who also have a weapon. Red flag law, same thing. It's hard to argue against them under a utilitarian principle. There may be some philosophical objections that negatives can have on framework. We'll get into that in a moment. But I think these specific creative strategies that are util based are going to be very difficult. Same thing with like climate change. There are numerous articles out there. The American Lung Association put out a statement signed by like 20 other public health organizations that say climate change is a public health emergency. Because it increases things like asthma, and there are heavy metal poisoning that comes about from that's going on with pollution, and so climate change and pollution and the environment in general should be treated as a public health issue according to these institutions. gun violence, according to many public institutions, should be treated as a public health emergency. So when you have a lot of this literature out there, topicality may not be the easiest way to go about it, especially on climate change, where it is a global issue, right? Climate change affects every country around the globe. Gun violence maybe doesn't affect every country around the globe. But climate change definitely does. And so to have some sort of global climate response that would limit some form of civil liberty would be a very unique affirmative. And you're going to have trouble probably beating it on a utilitarian ground unless you want to run one of those, I don't want to say bankrupt, but they're just intellectually not supported positions at this point by like the scientific community that says like global warming good, right? Those positions are probably not good positions to run. They're not based really on science. A majority of the scientific community doesn't agree with them. So it's just util not the best option for the negative, really. Util is a good option for the AF on this topic. You are going to have a lot of offense under util, but you have to win your framework, which I guess we can kind of start getting into at this point, which is neg strats on the topic. In general, I think negatives are always going to want to try to win their framework on this topic. It's going to be hard to win under most AF frameworks. The AF frameworks are going to be very literature heavy, biased towards the AF. It's not like in previous topics where there are many frameworks that can work in a bidirectional manner. Kant can work in a bidirectional manner in a lot of different topics. On this one, I don't know, because there's also a freedom to, be able to live, and you have to weigh those things. And so Kant may affirm on this topic, likely wouldn't negate. Even if you were to run Kant on the negative, it would probably be a hard road for it. I think most negatives are going to have to talk about like just rights being more important than life in general on a lot of different topics in a lot of ways, and to have to win that debate, it's going to be tough. There are frameworks though that support that position. Nethmin, you want to go into kind of probably one of the most obvious frameworks on this topic for the negative, and one that we'll likely hear most rounds.
Yeah, for sure. So libertarianism has long been a favorite negative strategy whenever the affirmative is any kind of expansion of state power. And libertarianism has historically done pretty well at NSDA nationals, especially recently. So I think libertarianism is going to be a really common and popular negative strategy. So the TLDR of libertarianism is that the role of the government is to be minimal. The best thing is a minimal state. The role of the government is to protect citizens' rights and do nothing else. So the state should protect your right to freedom of expression. The state should protect your property and your right to keep your property, but the state should not involve themselves in hindering your rights or redistributing your property, that kind of thing. So that's the thesis of libertarianism. So very obviously, libertarianism is going to be popular on this topic, in that libertarianism and most libertarian authors straight up say that the state should not intervene with people's rights. Where I think libertarianism negatives are going to struggle, and I think something to be aware of if you are going to plan on negating with libertarianism, is that you need to set some kind of bright line for what forms of governmental overreach are acceptable and what forms are not. Because, for example, most like libertarian authors will agree that some form of governmental redistribution of property or some form of governmental control on rights is a good thing, i.e. like most libertarians think like, sure, we should probably pay taxes in order to fund like the roads that everyone uses, but libertarians probably don't think we should pay taxes in order to fund like food stamps, right? So I think that negatives who are going to read libertarianism need to set a clear bright line for what their specific flavor of libertarianism defends, and you need to be able to demonstrate knowledge of that in cross, because I think one of the most awkward things when reading libertarianism is you kind of fumble around across and you have no idea what the framework says, and you stand up and read your blocks in the 2NR and you're like, nope, I figured it out, I know what it says. So just make sure that you're doing clear bright line setting from the beginning. And I guess the other thing I want to note about libertarianism negative strategies is that in order to beat the affirmative, you're going to have to win the framework debate. So this might seem fairly obvious if you've been reading libertarianism for a while, but a lot of traditional debaters will do this thing where they will read some NC with like whatever framework they think best fits their NC. And then in the 2NR, they'll just randomly try to win their contention level offense under the affirmative framework. I think that like Shatzkin talked about, trying trying to play the game on the affirmative's turf on this topic is just kind of a losing strategy when you're negating, unless you're going like full policy style and just reading like very specific disads to whatever plan text the affirmative enacts, if you end up having a round like that. But outside of rounds that are like advantage, counterplan, and disad versus plan, I think that you want to be winning the framework. So it's more times than not going to be an unwise idea to, in the 2NR, kick your libertarianism framework and try to win your contentions under the AC framework, because the AC will almost always outweigh in terms of post-fiat consequences. And what the libertarianism NC is really running with here is the idea that like a minimal state is the best and most ethical thing. So make sure that you're reading good framework cards and reading framework cards that the affirmative doesn't have prepped answers to, and then focus on winning one piece of contention level offense under your framing, as opposed to winning every single piece of contention level offense, but then absolutely losing the framing debate. So those are my thoughts on libertarianism.
Yeah, I think another neg rather that will be run a lot on this topic is going to deal with probably governmental legitimacy. We talked about how public health emergencies can be utilized by governments to kind of do anything. If gun violence is a public health emergency, if climate change is a public health emergency, if the flu becomes a public health emergency, if we start to devalue and make everything a public health emergency, you can start to see backlash occur because of that. And I think you saw some of that during the coronavirus, right? There is a lack of public trust in kind of public health institutions. A lot of that came about because of kind of poor messaging in a lot of ways, and just kind of being reinforced by some of the things that Nethmin talked about probably in the disinformation affirmative, helped reinforce some of these things that caused a lack of public trust in our institutions. But when you have this lack of public trust, you lose some of the governmental legitimacy. So the NC in this case would probably argue that we really don't need to limit civil liberties. What we need is to educate the public, right? If you were to limit civil liberties all the time instead of just educating the public on like why mask wearing was a good thing, maybe we didn't need to limit civil liberties like we did. Because mask wearing isn't really a violation on your civil liberties. Mask wearing doesn't prevent you from speaking freely. Mask wearing doesn't prevent you from traveling freely. Mask wearing functionally is like the no shirt, no shoes, no service sign at most restaurants, right? They're public health conditions that are created. People aren't saying you're trampling on my civil liberties when you can't wear when you're trying to go into a restaurant, shirtless. We generally recognize that as just being generally public health wise. Same thing with wearing shoes into different places. It's, to protect your health. There could be broken glass. There could be all sorts of stuff on the ground. Same thing with a mask in this case. It was a public health response to a disease being in the air, not a restriction on civil liberties. The restrictions on civil liberties that occurred during coronavirus were things like lockdowns, travel restrictions, forced business closures. Those things function as a restriction on civil liberties. And it's important to note the difference between them, because one of them is kind of, I don't want to say trivial, but one of them is a moderate inconvenience. The other one was an actual restriction on your liberty and lifestyle. And so to compare the two is really comparing apples and oranges, right? The restrictions on civil liberties that occurred that really impacted public trust were business closures, restaurants being forced to limit capacities, cruises not being able to operate, hair salons closing, just all sorts of things that upset your daily regular life that were a restriction on the government. And those things can undermine how we start to view the government and treat our government, especially if we start to use them, public health emergencies, on like a wide variety of issues. I think there's also just a general rule of law negative that probably is going to be talked about a lot, which is just that we should respect the laws, and laws are good. And when governments violate their own laws, it creates a government legitimacy problem. This is a very simple negative argument that can grant you util ground, right? Like you can talk about how that causes war, can cause more disease spread, it can cause stuff like that, and that can help you weigh against util. But I wouldn't put all of your eggs in the basket of outweighing on utilitarianism. It's part of the negative strategy, but it's not the end all be all. So don't fall into the trap of 2 NRs on most topics, like Nethmin said. And with that, I guess my final piece of advice that I have for you all at NSDA Nationals is prep out a lot of strategies. And we talked about mainly traditional and kind of util style strategies in this topic discussion. There are some critical strategies that you can look at that may be worthwhile to have in the toolbox kind of at NSDA Nationals if you run across that rare K-friendly panel. It's kind of helpful to have some of those critical arguments there. But basically, I would just say to have all the tools you can and have in your toolbox, have the traditional app, have the policy style app, have the answers to those things on the negative, have some different types of literature, because you're going to be getting judges from all across the country, some of whom have judged a lot, some of whom this may be their first tournament really judging. So with that, I wish you all good luck. Nethmin, do you have any other further advice?
My final piece of advice is very similar to what you just said. I think that debaters should make sure that they're reading a lot of the topic literature, because at these somewhat traditional leading national tournaments, the debaters that tend to win the most rounds are not the ones that have like weird critical back files from 5 years ago. They're the debaters who have done a lot of good research on the topic and know what they're talking about. And my second piece of advice is to always make sure you're adapting. And this kind of also ties into what Shatzkin just said about preparing lots of different strategies, but you're going to be a lot better at adapting if you have more than one case. So just make sure that you aren't going into each round and debating it as if you're debating in front of like your ordinal one at your favorite circuit tournament. So going into each round and reading paradigms and seeing what that panel wants to see, and adapting as best as you can to what they want, because ballot count matters for clearing at NSDAs. So make sure that you are appealing to your audience, not the audience you wish you had.
Yeah, split ballots in every round won't get you to the out rounds. You need to win 2 ballots in at least, I think, 2 rounds at NSDA Nationals, and you can split the rest after that. But you need to kind of get a couple of rounds where you're winning both ballots of the panel. So for all of that, we at Champions Briefs wish you good luck. And I'm Daniel Shatzkin.
And I'm Nethmin Liyanage, and thank you for watching our topic analysis on the 2021 NSDA topic. Good luck to you and your teammates at NSDAs.